Yeah, Emma Goldman. Oh, what's that? Oh, it's gone back to that. So that's one of her quotes there. She was involved in so many different campaigns and different events that it'd be impossible to cover the actual events in too great a detail. And because many of them could have to do a presentation in their own right. But imagine today a young working class immigrant woman from a reviled ethnic group succeeds in rousing a significant section of people around a radical political agenda. She makes the respectable classes shudder because she appears to break all the rules. She advocates tirelessly for the oppressed. Huge crowds gather to hear her speak, while the public eagerly consumes news of her whereabouts. And her name is used to scare little children and governments hound her. That was Emma. So her early life, she was born in 1869 into an Orthodox Jewish family in Kovno in the Russian Empire, which is now in Lithuania. She grew up in poverty in the Jewish ghettos. Her mother's first husband died of tuberculosis, and her mother, Taub, was devastated, but entered an arranged marriage to Abraham Goldman. Basically, she had to survive, really. He invested Taub's inheritance in a business that failed quickly. With the ensuing hardship, combined with emotional distance between husband and wife, it was a pretty tense relationship. Emma was the firstborn of this relationship, but Abraham had desperately wanted a son, and he saw the birth of a daughter as being a failure. Her father was very strict, and he beat the children and when they disobeyed, and even used a whip on Emma. She later speculated that her father's furious temper was at least partly a result of sexual frustration. Although serfdom had officially been abolished in Russia, the old attitudes were hard to shift. And when she was a young girl, she witnessed a peasant being whipped. This shocked her and deeply disturbed her, and it contributed to her lifelong distaste for violent authority. Her family moved to St. Petersburg, various other moves, but the poverty meant that she and her sisters had to find work. She begged her father to send her to school, but he told her, "Girls do not have to learn much. All a Jewish daughter needs to know is how to prepare gefilte fish, cut noodles fine, and give the man plenty of children." She continued with her own self-education, and she read Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel, What is to be Done, which was a big influence on her, as well as many other Russian radicals. At her workplace, which was a corset factory, she often had to fend off unwelcome advances from men. And unfortunately, around this time, she was raped. She said later that she could not believe sex should be that brutal. At 15, her father tried to force her into an arranged marriage. Emma resisted and told him she would only marry for love. In 1885, age 16, she emigrated with her half-sister to America. Her parents arrived a year later, driven out of Russia by increasing anti-Semitism. Her belief in America being a land of opportunity, hope, freedom, and liberty was soon shattered by the dismal realities of working class life. She settled in Rochester, upstate New York, and she found the factory work in America even harder than in Russia, and joined in the growing militancy against the inequality and inhuman working conditions that characterized industrializing America. She worked a 10-hour day as a seamstress, and it was at work that she met Jacob Kirshner, and they were married in 1887. Emma was soon disappointed with the marriage for various reasons, and she divorced him after 10 months. Her father refused to allow her back into their home. So, carrying her sewing machine in one hand and a bag with $5 in the other, she left Rochester and headed southeast to New York City. While still in Rochester, Emma had become aware of the Haymarket Affair. This was a mass meeting held in Chicago in 1886 in support of workers striking for the 8-hour day. At the end of a peaceful meeting, the police entered the square and a bomb was thrown by an unknown person. To this day, nobody knows where it came from. The police opened fire on the protesters. 7 policemen were killed, some by their fellow officers because they were firing like a circle, as well as 4 civilians that we know of. Many more were wounded, but exact figures for civilian casualties are difficult to determine, as many of them would not seek medical help. 8 anarchists who helped organize the rally were arrested, and 4 ended up being executed by hanging, even though there was absolutely no evidence that they had anything to do with the bomb, and some weren't even present in the square. When she arrived in New York, she met a young anarchist writer and activist called Alexandra Bertman, who then introduced her to Johann Most. He was an older anarchist writer and publisher of the newspaper Freiheit, which means freedom in German. And he was the foremost proponent of what was called propaganda of the deed. It was a specific political direct action meant to be exemplary to others as a catalyst for revolution. Most was quickly impressed by Emma and decided to make her his protege and persuaded her to undertake a speaking tour. He instructed her to condemn the inadequacy of a campaign for the 8-hour day. He said that campaigns like that were merely a diversion from the task of the complete overthrow of capitalism. Goldman duly conveyed this message at her public meetings. However, during her tour, she became more uncertain of this message. And when she was challenged at one meeting by an older worker who asked her what were men of his age to do, he was not likely to see the ultimate overthrow of the system. Was he also to forgo the release of perhaps 2 hours a day from his hated work? She became convinced that specific efforts for improvement as higher wages and shorter hours, far from being a diversion, were part of the transformation of society. When she told Most that she would no longer follow his lead, he became angry and told her, "Who is not with me is against me." It was around this time as well that she began living with Bertman in a communal apartment. "If I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution." Probably the most famous Goldman quote that has been on many posters, t-shirts, Facebook posts, all over. Of course, the problem is she never said that. It is taken from something she wrote in her autobiography, Living My Life. She had become involved in supporting a group of mainly female striking garment workers. She organised meetings and dances and social events with the aim of persuading more women to join the union and support the strike. At one of these, she was admonished by a male anarchist who told her that activists should not dance as much and with such reckless abandon as she did. It was undignified and it could only hurt the cause. Well, Emma was furious and told him to mind his own business. She said she was tired of having the cause constantly thrown in her face, and that she did not want to believe that, and she did not believe that something that stood for a beautiful ideal, for freedom from conventions and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. She would not become a nun in a cloister, and if it meant that, she did not want it. On 1st of July 1892, workers at the Carnegie Steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, were locked out in an attempt by the owner, Andrew Carnegie, the Carnegie Hall, Carnegie, to break their union organization. The union declared a strike, and the plant's manager, Henry Clay Frick, tried to bring in strikebreakers. He hired over 300 armed Pinkerton detectives to get the strikebreakers through. The strikers had armed themselves, and with the support of the locals, a gunfight began that lasted 12 hours. The Pinkertons were forced to surrender after 7 of them had been killed, and also 9 workers. The union had tried to persuade Frick to negotiate to end the fight, but he refused, and he wanted the state militia brought in. And on July the 12th, 4,000 soldiers surrounded the plant, and non-union labour was able to restart production. Emma Goldman and Alexandra Bertman decided that they needed to do something, and so resolved to kill Frick, who they saw as responsible for all the lives already lost. It was Bertman who was to do the deed, while Goldman was to explain their reasons, the propaganda, in the event of Bertman being killed. Well, Bertman failed, and he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Many of their fellow anarchists and the strikers themselves were highly critical of the attempt, and one of the most severe critics of them was their one-time mentor, Johann Most. He suggested at one point that Bertman was a stooge of Frick hired to discredit the strike. Goldman was furious and brought a horsewhip to Most's next public lecture and demanded that he prove his insinuations. He refused to even speak to her, so she struck him with the whip, broke it on her knee, and hurled the pieces at him. She continued to support Bertman and constantly wrote to him. He was put in solitary confinement for long periods, sometimes in a straitjacket. He tried several times to commit suicide. His prison experience left him physically and mentally damaged, and when he was finally released in 1906, he and Goldman's relationship had changed, and although they remained close friends for the rest of their lives, the romantic part of their relationship ended. The period from 1865 to 1896 is known as the Gilded Age in the United States. It was an era marked by ostentatious displays of wealth by the rich and of unrestrained corruption. Sounds familiar. In 1893, the United States suffered one of its worst economic crises. Unemployment rose higher than 20%, and hunger demonstrations sometimes gave way to riots. Emma Goldman began speaking to huge crowds in New York. On August the 21st, she spoke to a crowd of nearly 3,000 people in Union Square, where she encouraged unemployed workers to take immediate action. She was arrested and charged with inciting to riot. Apparently what did it was, she said, demand work. If they do not give you work, demand bread. And if they deny you both, take bread. She was asked to inform on other radicals in return for the charges being dropped, but she refused. She was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison. While in prison, she studied medicine. Upon her release, she was greeted by a crowd of nearly 3,000 people. She was asked to make lecture tours, but first she wanted to continue the medical studies she had started in prison. To do this, She sailed to Europe and lectured in London, Glasgow, and Edinburgh before going to Switzerland, where she gained 2 diplomas for midwifery. Returning to the United States, she alternated between lectures and midwifery. She conducted the first cross-country tour by an anarchist speaker. On 6th of September 1901, Leon Czoglas, an unemployed factory worker with a history of mental illness, shot US President William McKinley during a public speaking event. McKinley died 8 days later due to infection. Czoglas claimed to be an anarchist and said he had been inspired to act after attending a speech by Emma Goldman. The authorities used this as a pretext to charge her with planning McKinley's assassination. Czoglas had previously attended various anarchist events, but his manner and questions led many to become suspicious that he was a police spy. Emma was subjected to what she referred to as the 3rd degree, which basically today we know as torture, to force her to confess. She was finally released after 2 weeks in detention. Czoglas, despite considerable evidence of mental illness, was convicted of murder and executed. Goldman refused to condemn him, describing him as a supersensitive being. Her refusal to condemn Czoglas led to her being alienated from her fellow anarchists and vilified by the press. She withdrew from activism for a while and, using the name E.G. Smith, took on a series of nursing jobs and midwifery. After an English anarchist named John Turner was arrested under the Anarchist Exclusion Act and threatened with deportation, she was pulled back into activism and helped found numerous branches of the Free Speech League, which is an early forerunner of the American Civil Liberties Union. Turner was eventually deported, but Goldman began lecturing regularly on freedom of speech and will continue to do so for the rest of her life. In 1906, she founded her magazine, Mother Earth. Mother Earth reprinted selections from a variety of writers past and present, including the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin and British feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. Emma was the editor and wrote frequently on a range of topics, including anarchism, labour issues, atheism, sexuality, and feminism. It was at this time that Bertman was released. As I said before, he was a changed man, both physically and mentally. He was gaunt and prone to depression and suicidal thoughts. The romantic relationship had ended, but they remained friends. Then Bertman had an affair with a 15-year-old activist called Becky Edelson. This hurt Emma, but she considered it a consequence of his time in prison. To support him, she made him the editor of Mother Earth, while she toured the country giving lectures to raise funds to keep it going. Emma Goldman was a pioneer on the issue of birth control. She brought the young Margaret Sanger into the campaign against the 1873 Comstock Law, which prohibited the distribution of birth control literature, and so forged an indelible link between free speech and reproductive rights. Unlike Sanger, who was later to advocate a single-issue strategy, Goldman always insisted that birth control be viewed in the context of the broader social, economic, and political forces that led to its suppression. She had become convinced that birth control was essential to women's sexual and economic freedom while she was working as a nurse and midwife amongst the poor immigrant workers on the Lower East Side in New York in the 1890s. On her return from trips to Europe, she had smuggled contraceptive devices into the United States. By 1915, she was working in a mass movement for birth control, lecturing frequently on the right of the child not to be born, and demanding that women's bodies be freed from the coercion of government. At least twice, Goldman was arrested and charged with violating the Comstock Law. Although she did serve some time, it was Ben Reitman, her then lover, whose 6-month sentence for public advocacy of birth control was the longest jail sentence served at that time. Emma Goldman was a great admirer of Mary Wollstonecraft, the 18th century English philosopher and women's rights activist, who she called the pioneer of modern womanhood. She was an untiring advocate for the right of women to be fully equal in every way to men, arguing that women need to first internally cut loose from the weight of prejudices, traditions, and customs, and to liberate themselves through their own efforts. She said that being a mother or a sweetheart was not synonymous with being a slave or inferior, and saw marriage as a sort of legalized prostitution. She argued that access to birth control was necessary to empower women to live productive, creative, and healthy lives. She thought that a person's private life should reflect their public one, and castigated many male radicals for their attitude to women in their own homes. First wave feminism was a campaign of mostly middle-class white women demanding equal political rights and the right to vote. Emma Goldman had no time for the campaign for the vote. She saw it as a narrow goal, stating that women getting the vote would not change the political system. She saw no reason why women should not have equal right to vote with a man, as it could not make things any worse, but she said it would not make them any better. She maintained that for poor women, the right to vote was meaningless while economic and social injustice prevailed. Emma Goldman's stance on free love has often been misinterpreted, especially by men who saw it as an excuse for unfaithfulness. Against the institution of marriage, she advocated for the free association of individuals to choose their sexual partners and respect and love each other as equals. She thought that people needed to live together first to find out if they were compatible and able to sustain a permanent relationship. If a couple felt incompatible, then they should separate in a quiet and friendly manner. She saw love as the most powerful of human emotions and the resistor of all laws and conventions, and the most vital right as being the right to love and to be loved. She viewed homosexuality as natural, and that no form of consented sex between adults should be illegal or even ridiculed. Though she was not a pacifist, Emma Goldman insisted on the anarchist principle that the state had no right to make war. She believed that modern wars were fought on behalf of capitalists at the expense of the working class, and that conscription was a form of illegitimate coercion. As the United States drifted towards war in late 1916, Goldman threw her energy into opposing the government's military preparations. The anti-war movement was a product of a broad coalition of liberals, socialists, anarchists, and unionists, especially the IWW, which Industrial Workers of the World. Mother Earth was used as a forum for her and other anti-war activities. Within weeks of America's entry into the war in 1917, she helped launch the No Conscription League to encourage conscientious objectors, and spoke repeatedly against the draft, attracting 8,000 people at one meeting. Predictably, the government began to repress the anti-war movement in an almost hysterical patriotic pro-war and anti-radical crusade orchestrated by President Woodrow Wilson. Mother Earth, along with other periodicals opposing the war, were banned, and after a raid on its offices on June the 15th, 1917, Emma Goldman and Alexandra Berkman were arrested. They were charged with conspiring against the draft. They were convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison with the possibility of deportation at the end of their term. On her release, Emma was rearrested in the Palmer raids on the orders of J. Edgar Hoover, who was then head of the Justice Department's General Intelligence Division, which later became known as the FBI. Hoover advanced his career by implementing to the fullest extent the government's plan to deport foreign-born radicals. He wrote the briefs and presented the case against Goldman and Berkman himself. He called them the two most dangerous anarchists in the country. Jacob Kirshner, if you remember him, the man who she had been briefly married to in 1887, had renounced his American citizenship. And this gave an excuse for Hoover and the cause to deny Goldman's citizenship claims and deport her. On the 21st of December 1919, Goldman, Berkman, and over 200 other foreign-born radicals were herded onto a ship bound for Russia. When she had first heard of the revolution in Russia, Emma Goldman, along with most other radicals, welcomed the news. The role of the Soviets, the workers, peasants, and soldiers' councils, was something that especially enthused Emma. This form of organization from below seemed to match the ideals of anarchism or anarcho-syndicalism, to be more precise. But Lenin used the Soviets to achieve his control. Once in power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were determined to crush any opposition, and any criticism of them was deemed to be counter-revolutionary. When Emma Goldman arrived in Russia, this process was underway, and an initial admiration for the Bolsheviks turned to frustration and anger as she saw the ideals she had attached to the revolution being fully corrupted by Lenin and his followers. Infuriated by the suppression of anti-Bolshevik dissent, Goldman formally registered her protest with Lenin himself. There's that's a picture of the questions that she presented to Lenin. She and Berkman traveled around Russia to talk to ordinary people. She grew more and more disillusioned with the Bolshevik regime and quarreled with Berkman, who thought things would change once the counter-revolutionary whites were defeated. By the beginning of 1921, she had resolved to leave Russia. She was delayed by the death of Peter Kropotkin, the veteran Russian anarchist theorist, who she greatly admired and with whom she had met on many occasions. Then, in February 1921, workers in Petrograd went on strike, protesting about the harsh conditions and lack of food, fuel, and clothing. This was followed by the Kronstadt Rebellion. When the Kronstadt Soviet expressed solidarity with the striking workers, and after a mass meeting, they sent a list of demands to the Soviet government that included new and free elections to the Soviets, the release of all political prisoners, freedom of speech and press, and the freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasants, amongst many other demands. The Kronstadt Soviet had been a stalwart supporter of the February and October revolutions and had impeachable reputation in the revolutionary movement. The Kronstadt Soviet was made up a lot of sailors of the Russian Navy, which was based on the island where Kronstadt was. All this shocked the Bolshevik leadership, who immediately denounced them as counter-revolutionaries. Leon Trotsky sent the Red Army to crush the rebellion, telling the soldiers to shoot them like partridges. The speed and ferocity with which the Kronstadt Soviet was smashed shocked Bergman, who finally realized that Emma Goldman was right and there was no possibility that the Bolshevik regime would relinquish their power. It was probably only her international fame that had saved her from simply becoming another nameless victim of the anti-anarchist crusade by the Bolsheviks. Emma Goldman and Alexandra Bergman moved to Berlin. There they both separately began writing of their experiences in Russia. They found themselves at odds with many on the left, including their fellow comrades, who still believed that the Bolsheviks were just doing what they had to do to secure the revolution. She finished her book in 1923 and sent the manuscript entitled My 2 Years in Russia to the publisher. Much to Goldman's anger and dismay, it was only upon receiving the first printed copies of the book that she became aware that the publisher had changed the title to My Disillusionment with Russia, and that the last 12 chapters, which was half the book, were entirely missing, including an afterword which Goldman felt was the most vital part of the book. Her time in Russia had confirmed her belief that the end does not justify the means. She accepted that violence was a necessary evil in the process of social transformation, but said it was one thing to employ violence in combat as a means of defense, but it was quite another thing to make a principle of terrorism and to institutionalize it in the social struggle. Her views were unpopular amongst radicals, as most still wanted to believe in the Russian Revolution. When she moved to Britain in 1924, and she was virtually alone in condemning the Bolsheviks. On hearing that she might be deported, a Welsh miner named James Colton offered to marry her in order to give her British nationality. Despite her political objections to the institution of marriage, she engaged in the legal formality to get a British passport. She was then free to travel. And in 1934, she was even allowed to give a lecture tour in the United States. In 1936, Bergman, then 67 and very ill, committed suicide. Shortly after came the Spanish Civil War and Revolution. Despite her advanced age and still grieving over Bergman, Emma hurled herself into the Spanish cause with an enthusiasm reminiscent of her early activist years in America. In Spain, she saw, in her view, the only peasant and working class revolution ever to be inspired by anarchist ideals. Anarchism had penetrated deeply into the minds of the workers and peasants of Spain. The largest union in Spain was the anarcho-syndicalist CNT, National Confederation of Labour in English. When Emma visited collectivized towns and farms in Aragon in 1936 and the Levant in 1937, she was thrilled by what seemed to her to be the beginnings of a complete change of society. She was asked to direct the English propaganda campaign of the CNT, and she worked tirelessly, writing hundreds of letters to supporters and editors in the English-speaking world. As usual, she was not afraid to express her views and opinions, and she disagreed with the participation of the CNT FAI, which is Iberian Anarchist Federation, in the coalition government of 1937, and the concessions they made to the increasingly powerful communists for the sake of the war effort. The Spanish Revolution was suppressed by a coalition of liberals and communists, and then Franco finally triumphed in 1939. Emma Goldman moved to Canada, where she devoted the last year of her life to securing political asylum and financial support for the women and children refugees of the Spanish War. She died in Toronto on May the 14th, 1940. After her death, the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service allowed Goldman's body to be readmitted to the United States, and she was buried in Chicago's Waldheim Cemetery, near the Haymarket anarchist who had so inspired her. And the gravestone includes the quote, "Liberty will not descend to a people must raise themselves to liberty." After her death in the post-war atmosphere, Emma Goldman became an almost forgotten figure, and her works fell out of print. But in the 60s and 70s, first with the anti-Vietnam protests, then the rise of second-wave feminism, her writings were rediscovered. This led to a reassessment of her ideas, but often only certain aspects of her philosophy were used that would fit in with a certain agendas. Her ideas on equal rights for women, birth control, anti-militarism, and her constant advocacy of free speech was recognized by many different campaigns. What all these groups conveniently forgot, or rather tried to sweep under the carpet, was her political ideas, her anarchism, her direct challenge to the legitimacy of the state, private property, and religion in whatever form they took, and her unswerving belief in the need for revolution and not reform. Today, there seems to be another revival in interest in her ideas. There have been many more biographies published in the last few decades that mostly try and take her politics as a whole and not compartmentalize them. And she continues to provoke, She continues to provoke hatred and admiration, but she cannot be ignored. So we'll end this by listening to her speak.
I'm delighted to be back in the United States, my hunting ground of 35 years, the country where I had my innings in the social and economic struggle, and where I decided to devote myself to the presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race.
What do you think about Russia, Miss Goldman?
I consider Russia and America the most interesting countries in the world today.
How about Hitler?
I don't know him and don't want to.
What is your opinion of Italy?
Beautiful country minus Mussolini.
Miss Goldman, should the government here object to your speeches of anarchism, would you change them or leave the country?
I will leave the country rather than deny my ideas. I prefer to stick to my guns.